All right, guys, so in this section of notes, we're going to be talking about the foreign policies of Theodore Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson. So to give you a quick overview of their foreign policies, Theodore Roosevelt, he believed that Americans were superior people. He believed in a strong military force and building upon that strong military force. He believed in negotiation over war, try to work things out before going to battle. He also believed that Latin America, Asia, and Africa were inferior people and incapable of running their own government or industrial process. And then he also believed in the Monroe Doctrine, so he would warn European powers from interfering in U.S. interests. Taft, he was Republican as well. He had some experience in dealing with imperialist rivals, but he lacked leadership. He lacked the leadership that Roosevelt had. He also believed in dollars for bullets, which was just simply that U.S. investments would effectively substitute for bullets or war, and thus offer a more peaceful and less cohesive way of maintaining stability and order. And expanding American economic activities in China was something else he really felt strongly about. Wilson, he intervened militarily in the Caribbean more often than any other American president. In Mexico, he felt compelled to show them the way, how to set up their own government, democratic government. And Wilson recognized something that Theodore Roosevelt and Taft didn't quite recognize, and this was that people more and more are going to have the desire to self-govern, have a democratic government, but a lot of them don't know how to get there, and that's kind of where Wilson would say, you know, it's our duty, our responsibility to kind of help these people and support these people to their democratic aspirations. So some of our main focuses for this section of notes is going to be on the foreign policies of Theodore Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson, as I said before, but we're also going to be talking about the U.S. and how they wanted to build the Panama Canal and the reasons for that. All right, so setting the scene. By 1900, the United States had emerged as a genuine world power. It controlled several overseas territories and had a large and vigorous economy. After the assassination of President William McKinley, his vice president, Theodore Roosevelt, became president in 1901. The new president developed a foreign policy to support the nation's new role in the world. The Spanish-American War brought home to Americans the need for a shorter route between the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. A canal built across Central America would link the two oceans, making global shipping much faster and cheaper. Okay, so I wanted to pull up this picture here just to kind of show you the impact that the Panama Canal could have or did have. So if you are traveling from New York City and you are trying to transport goods to San Francisco, you have to take this route, which is extensive. However, if we can help finish building the Panama Canal, then we can take this shortcut and save ourselves so much time and money. Building the canal. The Isthmus of Panama was the ideal location for a route. In 1879, a French company bought the rights from Colombia to build a canal across Panama. So, concession. A concession is basically just a grant that one country can give another over a piece of land, as long as they promise to use that piece of land for a specific purpose that is explained before, you know, the grant is given. In 1902, Congress authorized the purchase of French assets. Now, the French were selling this area, the Panama Canal, because they had began building, but because of diseases spreading in the area among their workers and mismanagement, things were falling apart, they were running out of money, and they were forced to sell. And we were interested. The French first offered to us for $100 million, but we weren't willing to pay that much, and so when the price finally dropped to $40 million, we agreed. So technically, the French did not own this land when they sold it to us. They just owned the concession or the grant to use that land for a specific purpose. Colombia actually had control of this land, and so we had to create a treaty with Colombia in order to continue to build the Panama Canal, and this was known as the Spooner Act. Now, at first, Colombia did not really want to accept our treaty, so because Colombia did not really want to create a treaty with us, we decided to support the Panamanians in a rebellion against Colombia in 1903. So they did end up winning, the Panamanians, and we recognized Panama as an independent nation and became its protector. Building the canal, the act required negotiations, which went nowhere, and the act they're referring to here is the Spooner Act. Again, Colombia had no interest in creating a treaty with us, and so we decided to support the Panamanians instead. After a revolt, Panama was recognized as an independent with the U.S. as its protector, and construction of the canal began in 1904. Building the canal, workers were brought in from several countries and trained. The canal was finished in 1914, 6 months ahead of schedule, and $23 million under budget. Reaction to the canal. So Roosevelt's opponent did not appreciate the methods we had used to secure the canal zone. Most Americans, convinced that the canal was vital to national security and prosperity, approved President Roosevelt's actions in Panama. The Panama Canal, however, left a legacy of ill will among Latin Americans toward the U.S. In recognition of the illegal means in which the canal was acquired, Congress voted to pay $25 million to Colombia in 1921, 2 years after Roosevelt had died. So Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy. This quote here kind of sums up his diplomacy. Speak softly and carry a big stick, and you will go far. So Roosevelt was really big into military. He believed in the expansion of military. And because of other countries being in fear of military force, he was able to conduct a very aggressive foreign policy. And that's exactly what he did. So in Roosevelt's view, the big stick was the United States Navy. The Roosevelt Corollary. In December 1904 and 1905, Roosevelt issued message to Congress known as the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. In this corollary, Roosevelt denied that the U.S. wanted any more territory. The U.S. would, however, intervene in foreign territories to prevent intervention from other powers. U.S. intervention in Latin America became very common, but obviously angered many Latin Americans. It also angered Congress, who felt Roosevelt was weakening their power while strengthening his own. Roosevelt as a peacemaker. So in Asia, the president's chief concern was to preserve an open door policy, or open door to trade with China. However, the Russo-Japanese War, which began in 1904, posed a great threat to Asian security. And just remember, the open door policy was just this policy that all nations should be allowed to trade with China. In August 1905, Roosevelt mediated a peace agreement to the Russo-Japanese War. In doing this, Roosevelt succeeded in making trade in China open to all nations. His role as a mediator, won him the Nobel Peace Prize. Foreign policy after Roosevelt. So under Roosevelt's presidency, the U.S. assumed a forceful role in foreign affairs. His successors were thrown into a complex of mix of political alliances and world events. William Howard Taft and Woodrow Wilson both continued Roosevelt's legacy, but with unique methods of diplomacy. Taft and his dollar diplomacy. So William Howard Taft was elected president in 1908 and was not nearly as aggressive as Roosevelt in pursuing foreign policy aims. Taft's main foreign policy goals were to maintain the open door to Asia and preserve stability in Latin America. So Taft substituted dollars for bullets using dollar diplomacy. Dollars for bullets, this just meant maintaining orderly societies abroad through increased American investment in foreign economies. This was not successful, unfortunately. The results were not always profitable, and many foreign countries opposed U.S. influence, and this became a bit of an issue, and public opinion started to turn against expansion. So ended up creating enemies in Latin America and other foreign countries. Wilson and the Mexican Revolution. So President Woodrow Wilson's intervention in Mexico led to further anti-American feelings in Latin America. Wilson stopped using Taft's dollar policy and announced that the U.S. would apply moral and logistical standards to foreign policy decision. So when Mexico's president was assassinated for trying to implement democratic reforms, the U.S. felt the need to get involved. Now, why did they feel the need to get involved? Well, we had invested $1 billion in Mexico oil mines, lands, and railroads. And the current president promised to recognize foreign investment in the U.S. if the U.S. government supported him as a new leader. Europeans and American investors agreed to recognize him as president, but Wilson refused. This put an end to the dollar policy and announced the U.S. would apply, again, moral and logistical standards to foreign policy decision. This decision led to a complex and bloody confrontation with Mexico, and many American and Mexican lives were lost. Wilson's moral decision did not work well. His interference in Mexican affairs soured relations between the two countries for years to come. I just wanted to finish up this lesson with the relations that we have with Mexico today. So the U.S.-Mexican relationship remains relatively strong. However, there is tension at times, definitely recently, since January 2017. In the most recent years, our two countries, Mexico and the U.S., have worked very hard to support one another and strengthen our relationship economically. However, President Trump said that Mexico should pay for the border wall, which would cost about $85 million. And Mexico obviously does not want to pay for that. But they are interested in continuing to work on security between the nations, bilateral security, and then also work on migration management efforts. Mexican leaders are preparing for a possible U.S. withdrawal from NAFTA, which could severely impact the Mexican economy, although renegotiations are continuing. So that's kind of our current relationship with Mexico today.